Hello viewers, welcome to the Bachelor's course of Population Studies. Today we will discuss about the distribution of BPL families in India. Poverty is where people's basic needs for food, clothing and shelter are not being met. It's generally of two types. Absolute poverty is synonymous with destitution and occurs when people cannot obtain adequate resources, measured in terms of calories or nutrition, to support a minimum level of physical health. Absolute measures means about the same everywhere and can be eradicated as demonstrated by some countries. Relative poverty occurs when people do not enjoy a certain minimum level of living standards as determined by a government and enjoyed by the bulk of the population. These varies from country to country, sometimes within the same country also. At present, 29.8% of the Indian population lives below the poverty line, that is BPL. In the category of poor falls the people whose daily income is less than 28.65 rupees, that is 56 cents a day in cities and 22.42 rupees a day in villages. But do you think this amount is enough to survive even for a day in the country where every food item is available at sky-high prices? This means the actual number of people living below the poverty line is much higher, as according to the statistical data, anyone earning 30 rupees won't be considered as poor but must be facing the same difficulties in life. Let's see some facts on poverty in India. Where do the majority of poor live in India? 60% of the poor still reside in the states of Bihar, Jharkhand, Orissa, Uttar Pradesh and Uttarakhand. The reason for these states to be in the category of poorest states is because 85% of the tribal people live here. Also, most of these regions are either flood prone or suffer from drought-like conditions. These conditions hamper agriculture to a great extent, on which the household income of these people depends. According to the Global Hunger Index Report 2012 by the International Food Research Institute, India ranks 65 in Global Hunger Index. Though there is no shortage of food production in India, our nation still has the highest percentage of underweight children under the age of 5. India is working hard to become a superpower by 2020. But what about these poor in India, as our nation still lags behind in improving Global Hunger Index? India at present has a greater share of the poor around the world. 30 years ago, India was home of 1/5 of the world's poor, but now it is a home to 1/3 of the world's poor. This means we now have more poor in India as compared to 30 years ago. International poverty line stands at $1.25 per day, and in 2010, 32.7% of the total population in India was below this line. Below poverty line is an economic benchmark and poverty threshold used by the Government of India to indicate economic disadvantage and to identify individuals and households in need of government assistance and aid. Below poverty line, that is BPL, is determined using various parameters which vary from state to state and within states. The present criteria are based on a survey conducted in 2002. Going into a survey due for a decade, India's central government is undecided on criteria to identify families below poverty line. Internationally, an income of less than $1.90 per day per head, approximately $2 of purchasing power parity, is defined as extreme poverty. By this estimate, about 32.7% of Indians are extremely poor. Income-based poverty lines consider the bare minimum income to provide basic food requirements. It does not account for other essentials such as health care and education. It's a big drawback. Income-based poverty lines in India. The poverty line was originally fixed in terms of income and food requirements in 1978. It was stipulated that calorie standard for a typical individual in rural areas was 2400 calories and was 2100 calorie in urban areas. Then the cost of grains that fulfills this normative standard was calculated. This cost was the poverty line. In 1978, it was rupees 61.80 per person per month for rural areas and rupees 71.30 for urban areas. This income is bare minimum to support the food requirements and does not provide much for other basic essential items like health and education, which are very important for living. That is why sometimes the poverty lines have been described as starvation lines. On number of bases, the below poverty criteria has been criticized by various economists. Social activist Mariam Dhavle, State Secretary of the All India Democratic Women's Association, has found that the criteria for determining below poverty line status was puzzling and one that excludes the deserving. She said, if you have a pakka house, a two-wheeler, a fan, you are ineligible. The pakka house could have been in your family for generations and is not necessarily a reflection of your present situation. There was a government scheme once in which girls were given cycles to ensure they went to schools. Because the girls had a cycle, they were not counted as below poverty line. The method of ranking and also questionnaire are bound to ensure that only a small percentage of the poor can score the highest or near highest marks. It is like trying to distinguish between the poor, very poor, very poor and extremely poor and so on. This is the classic manner in which neoliberal policy makers made poverty disappear. You are no longer poor because you are not as poor as the poorest of the poor. Isn't it amazing? With a narrow set of automatic inclusion criteria being applied, the large mass of the rural poor will be marked poor or non-poor through a ranking system. The questions are odd and have little connection with the actual condition. Again, exclusion and inclusion criteria have been a bad choice. The list automatically excludes peasants with 2.5 acres of irrigated land who own a tube well. With hugely fluctuating incomes, large debt burdens on poor peasants, vagaries of the weather, droughts or floods, such automatic exclusion would amount to meting out grave injustice to a large section of rural India. destitute people have been defined as those living on alms, as they will be the automatic inclusion list. But if, for example, a family of 2 senior citizens who are forced to work, say 4 or 5 days a week or 4 to 5 days a month just to survive, they will not be included as destitute, as they do not beg. It's shocking. Let's have a broad view of distribution of below poverty line families in India. The methodology to measure poverty was first devised by expert group headed by Y.K. Alag in 1979, which was further improvised by the expert group headed by D.T. Lakkarwala in 1993. The Planning Commission has periodically estimated poverty lines and poverty ratios for each of the years for which large sample surveys on household consumer expenditures have been conducted by National Sample Survey Organization (NSSO). These surveys are normally conducted on quinquennial basis. The last quinquennial survey in this series was conducted in 2009-10, that is NSSO 66th round. However, since 2009-10 was not a normal year because of a severe drought, the NSSO repeated the large scale survey in 2011-12, that is 68th round. The summary results of this survey were released on 20th June 2013. In December 2005, Planning Commission constituted an expert group under the chairmanship of Professor Suresh D. Tendulkar to review the methodology for estimation of poverty. The committee submitted its report in December 2009 and computed poverty lines and poverty ratios for 2004-5. For comparisons, they also computed poverty lines and poverty ratios for 1993-94 with identical methodology. These were accepted by the Planning Commission. The next large sample survey of household consumer expenditure was again conducted in 2009-10. Following the Tendulkar Committee methodology, Planning Commission made estimates of poverty for 2009-10 released in 2012. Since several representations were made suggesting that the Tendulkar poverty line was too low, the percentage of persons below the poverty line in 2011-12 have been estimated as 25.7% in rural areas, 13.7% in urban areas and 21.9% for the country as a whole. The respective ratios for the rural and urban areas were 41.8% and 25.7% and 37.2% for the country as a whole in 2004-5. It was 51.5% in rural areas, 31.8% in urban areas and 45.3% for the country as a whole in the year 1993-94. In 2011-12, India had 270 million persons below the Tendulkar poverty line as compared to 407 million in 2004-5. That is a reduction of 137 million persons over a 7-year period. During the 11-year period, that is 1993-94 to 2004-5, the average decline in the poverty ratio was much low. It was just 0.74%. It accelerated to 2.18 percentage points per year during the 7-year period. Therefore, it can be concluded that the rate of decline in poverty ratio during the most recent years was about 3 times of that experienced in the 11 years in the period of 1993-94 to 2004-5. It's important to note that although the trend decline documented above is based on Tendulkar poverty line, which is being reviewed and may be revised by Rangarajan committee, an increase in poverty line will not alter the facts of a decline. While the absolute levels of poverty would be higher, the rate of decline would be similar. The Planning Commission released estimates of poverty for 93-94 and 2004-5 derived from Tendulkar method in 2011. Subsequently, based on the same methodology, the poverty ratio for 2009-10, 11-12 were derived by the Commission in 2012 and 13 respectively. The estimate of poverty ratio and number of poor at the national level for the years 1993-94, 2004-5 and 2011-12 derived from Tendulkar methodology are shown in the table on the screen, that is table number 2. The rate of decline in poverty ratio during different period is given in table 3. Let's discuss the concept of multidimensional poverty. There are many non-monetary indicators like education, health, sanitation, water, electricity, etc. That is extremely important for understanding the many dimensions of poverty that people experience. The Global Multidimensional Poverty Index is an index of acute multidimensional poverty. Since 2010, the UNDP Human Development Reports have published a multidimensional poverty index using the most recent existing data. The 2014 MPI covers 108 countries and 5.4 billion people disaggregated by 780 subnational regions. The 2015 Multidimensional Poverty Index counts 1.6 billion people as multidimensionally poor, with the largest global share in South Asia and the highest intensity in sub-Saharan Africa. India's reduction in multidimensional poverty was over 50% higher than its reduction of income poverty, and that's a good change. This finding, which compares MPI trends with income poverty trends 1993-4 to 2003-4 as reported by the Tendulkar committee, is true for the multidimensionally poor people, whether in absolute or in relative terms. There are some issues in poverty estimation which we will discuss. There have always been some issues which should be resolved while determining a poverty line. There is an issue about the poverty line basket or PLB, all India or state specific baskets. Many experts advise the use of single all India poverty line, or rather a poverty line basket or PLB to derive state specific rural urban basket for goods and services, the access to which separates the poor from the non-poor. This becomes crucial in a continental sized country such as ours that is marked by significant variability in living environment, in dietary patterns, in climatic conditions and preferences, in prices of goods and services across states, and as between rural and urban areas even within the same state. The expert group Rangarajan proposes to revert back to the earlier practice of having separate all India poverty line baskets for rural and urban areas, by reference to which the state level and rural and urban poverty lines will be derived. It would be clear from the common reference of poverty line basket of goods and services in the methodologies of the task force by Alag committee and the Lakkadwala and Tendulkar expert groups that the underlying metric of living standards is consumption expenditure rather than incomes of the households. This conscious decision follows from the significant difficulties of capturing household incomes through recall based, typically with a 30-day reference period, surveys conversed over a moving sample of households. Post the acceptance of the report of the 1979 task force, the calorie norms developed by the task force became the basis of the official All India PLB, separately for the rural and urban populations, and their price adjusted monetary equivalence became a state level poverty lines on the recommendations of expert group Lakkadwala. However, Tendulkar group consciously moved away using calorie norms to derive the All India PLB. In view of the fact that calorie consumption calculated by converting the consumed quantities of food in the last 30 days are collected by NSS has not been found to be well correlated with the nutrition outcomes observed from other specialized surveys either over time or across space. This position merits a very careful review. These two estimates of consumption, that is NSS and NAS, do not match in any country. India is no exception. What is alarming in India is that the difference between the NSS and NAS consumption is widening over time. For example, the difference was less than 10% in late 1970s, it rose to 50% in 2004-05. At the aggregate level, the NAS consumption has always been more than NSS consumption. What are the poverty estimates by the World Bank? The World Bank estimates the incidence of poverty in its member countries at regular intervals. The approach of poverty estimation by the World Bank is similar to those employed in India and in most of the developing countries. The World Bank estimates of poverty are based on the poverty line of US $1.25 per person per day measured at 2005 international price and adjusted to local currency using purchasing power parity conversion factor computed in the World Bank. The international poverty line is worked out as the average of national poverty lines in poorest 15 countries in terms of consumption per capita using 2005 International Comparison Program data. The poverty estimates made by the World Bank are based on same poverty line for all its member countries. In contrast, the Planning Commission methodology uses state specific and also region specific, that is rural and urban poverty lines. Therefore, these poverty lines capture the regional prices more precisely. The methodology of poverty estimation by the World Bank does not allow for cost of living differential within countries, and it also does not distinguish between transient and chronic poverty, which is critical in devising the strategy for poverty alleviation, particularly in the low income developing countries. In terms of the latest set of purchasing power parity values by World Bank 2014, the national poverty line of the Planning Commission for 2011-12, after adjusting it to Indian currency using PPP conversion factor, is $1.94 US a day, about $2 a day. The estimates of poverty in India are based on a methodology which stands far apart, for it is able to measure the incidence of poverty by capturing the demographic pattern and consumer behavior separately in rural areas and urban areas, and also by capturing the state-wise variation in the prices of goods and services. To conclude, I would say, though the poverty has gone down in India substantially since independence, but much needs to be done to bring down the poverty in absolute terms. The rate of decline in poverty ratio during the most recent 7 years period, that is 2004-5 to 11-12, was about 3 times of that experienced in 11-year period of 1993-94 to 2004-5. Reviewing the methods of estimation of poverty in other countries, the expert group Rangarajan arrived at the conclusion that neither their methodological nor procedural aspects are superior to what is being used in India at present. But the authorities working on the measurement of poverty need to resolve the issues in the measurement of poverty estimation. We can use Global Multidimensional Poverty Index to measure poverty, which is an index of acute multidimensional poverty, and it includes very important indicators like education, health, sanitation, water, electricity, etc. to understand many dimensions of poverty that people experience. That's all with today's lecture. I hope this must have added to your knowledge. Next time we'll discuss about another important dimension of poverty. Till then, have a nice time. Bye-bye.